Okay. Good afternoon. Welcome to today's conversation, Can Elite Higher Education Reform Itself? I'm Rick Hess, Director of Education Policy Studies here at AEI. Great to have you all with us. In recent years, elite higher education has been rocked by concerns about politicization, campus intolerance, and declining academic rigor. The Trump administration, over the last 90 days, has moved aggressively to confront these issues, making unprecedented demands and threatening unprecedented financial penalties at high-profile institutions. Columbia University and Harvard University have been at the eye of the storm over the last 2 or 3 months. There are big questions before them. Can these institutions address the problems that have been flagged? Can they effectively fight the Trump administration? How should they respond to Trump administration efforts? 2 organizations in the midst of all of this are the Stand Columbia Society and the 1636 Forum, which were formed by alumni at Columbia and Harvard to attempt to reform these institutions from within. Tao Tan and Allison Wu, who helped found these organizations, are here with me today to discuss the problems on campus, the challenges ahead, and what leaders need to do now. We're going to have a conversation about these organizations, the landscape at Harvard and Columbia, and what's ahead for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up and we'll take a few questions. For those of you watching at home, if you want to send your questions to Annika Hernandez, we're on X at hashtag Hess Ivy League Reform. That's hashtag Hess Ivy League Reform. All right, so I've got with me today Tao and Allison. Tao is a co-founder of the Stand Columbia Society. He teaches at the Columbia Business School. He serves on the Education Committee of the Columbia University Senate, and he received his BA and MBA from Columbia University. Allison Wu is the CEO and co-founder of the 1636 Forum. She's a former principal at Slow Ventures and received her MBA from Harvard Business School. Guys, thank you for joining me today. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks for having us.
So let's start with this. I think a lot of folks, like me, have maybe heard of the Stand Columbia Society and the 1636 Forum, or perhaps they haven't. But what are these? When did they get formed? What role are you guys trying to play at these august institutions?
I can start since we were started earlier. 1636 Forum is a community of about 20,000 Harvard alums who are focused on academic excellence, academic freedom, student safety, and good governance at the university. We were formed because last year, in January of 2024, after the October 7th attacks and what happened on campus following that, Sam Lessin, who's an alumnus of Harvard College, ran this last-minute write-in campaign to get onto the Harvard Board of Overseers. He ultimately didn't make it on, but there was a lot of momentum during his campaign, which I helped with, and we learned that one of the key things was there were a lot of alumni who cared about the school, wanted to help it get back on track, but had no way of knowing what was actually going on and what could make a difference. You know, the school has its official PR channels. You can read some articles here and there in mainstream media, but it's hard to know. And so we started by just writing a weekly newsletter for alumni about what was actually going on. And it took off, and today 20,000 alums read it each week.
Tao, how about Stand Columbia Society?
Thank you so much, Rick. So I'm Tao Tan, co-founder of the Stand Columbia Society. And in many ways, our story is parallel to Allison's. Stand Columbia Society was founded last August, and we also have several thousand subscribers. And our story was a little different in the sense that last August was after several months of a lot of ferment at Columbia. There was the police bust last May. We had a new president come in at the same time. And what happened was a lot of us who were involved with Columbia started receiving these emails from our classmates and our friends asking questions about Columbia and how it worked, and questions that showed not a lot of awareness of how the unique operating and financial circumstances of higher education. So one question that I got about 50 times was, why can't we spend the endowment? which for those of you who know how endowments work, you know the answer to that. Another question we got is some variation of, this professor said this. Why does he or she still work there? And for those of you who understand how tenure works, that obviously is not an easy answer. So after a while, a few of us got together and said, you know what? We've been answering these same questions over and over again to the point of actually copying and pasting them into emails. Why don't we start a newsletter where we can publish explainers of how Columbia works and offer our thoughts? And we've taken an approach which is, I would say, 75% education, helping people understand how these unique institutions work and why they work. And I would say 25% advocacy, because we certainly have opinions. Rick, you said something earlier, which is, how do these groups change the course of how Columbia works? I don't think we're going to change the course. I think we're going to influence it, or at least we hope to influence it. And we hope to influence it in a productive direction, which means getting back to excellence in teaching, in research, in patient care, and all the wonderful things that American universities do. And I would say what was behind it was not just merely this idea of we were getting impatient with writing the same things on emails over and over again. I would say it's because we all realized that American universities are critical national assets. They are very, very important American institutions. They have shaped how this country's growth, this country's prosperity for the past century, if not longer. And this has personal resonance for me. My father came to the United States in 1987. And my mother and I came to the United States in the summer of 1989, and that date was not a coincidence. And it was done so by the purpose of an American university where my father went to study. My father ended up pursuing a career in technology. He ended up working on the camera systems on a Predator drone. And for football fans out there, he also invented the L first down line. But these are what American universities can do. They can build knowledge, they can supercharge the economy, they can establish American technological and economic leadership in the world. And that is why they're important. And last summer, I think a lot of us just looked at each other and said, what are we doing? We are squandering these critical national assets. The analogy that comes to my mind is circular firing squad. So a few of us looked at each other and said, this isn't right. What can we do to shape the conversation in a much more productive way where people aren't talking past each other, and we can once again get our great universities that have changed the world and certainly changed America's place in the world back into a position of teaching, research, learning, and patient care.
So, here at AEI, I love the vision you just sketched. Mike McShane and I wrote, a piece out of our book, Getting Education Right, last spring about don't burn down Harvard. That, you can't build 400-year-old institutions from scratch. It takes 400 years. That's how things go. But I think I and many of us in this building have grown extraordinarily frustrated over the last 15 or 20 years with the trajectory of higher education. That it has seemed to become politicized, it has seemed to become stifling, it seems to have lost sight of first principles. That's been a gradual process. The last 90 days have not been gradual. There's been a lot coming. I think even those of us who try to keep up with this from the outside have maybe found it challenging. I'm wondering if you guys could give us a sense from where you sit of what is the situation on campus, and can you give us a little bit of a timeline of development over the last, say, 3 months of where we are now in terms of the relationship between the universities and kind of the Federal Department of Education and other agencies?
You want to start?
Sure. Well, first of all I know is what I read in the papers. But let's back up a little bit. So I'll try to be concise here. So Columbia was one of the first universities to receive letters from the Department of Education as part of the Joint Task Force that said, your grants are frozen, and I think in our case it was something like $430 million worth of grants, and for the federal government to even begin having a conversation, there are 9 preconditions, I think, that were laid out. So that was sent out. About a couple weeks later, Columbia responded with a detailed document that addressed these 9 preconditions to the satisfaction of the federal government. Or seemingly to the satisfaction of the federal government. Then we had a couple of situations.
What was the reaction on campus to that?
Yeah, so see, this is what bothers me a little bit. The reaction on campus was Columbia capitulated to the federal government. And I think that's the incorrect framing, because if you actually read the 9 things that the document said, it was things like, you should enforce your rules. you should not have discrimination. You should have viewpoint diversity in your classes and your faculty and your offerings and so on and so forth. Aside from one particular recommendation, which I happen to disagree with, which is putting one of our departments under receivership, which also didn't happen, this was a recommendation that could have been written by a faculty committee. And instead, there were 3 government logos on top, and the framing of that very much made it from, hey, these are thoughtful reforms that not only should Columbia thoughtfully consider, but many of them were actually underway for quite some time by that point in time. But because it had come from the government, it was seen as unacceptable. And I understand that particular view. But I would go further to say that the initial batch of reforms that came around, many of them were perfectly reasonable reforms. So I'll give you one great example. Unlike most universities, Columbia does not have a formal police force. It has a public safety arm that has no arrest powers. They have no power and no ability to physically, move people who are protesting or obstructing access or so on and so forth, unless those people become a danger to themselves and others. And we saw this happen last year when, a lot of you may have seen, students set up an encampment on, I think, 3 different lawns. Students took over Hamilton Hall, which is where the undergraduate school is headquartered. And our public safety officers just didn't have the ability to physically remove students. And because all they could do is say, hey, please leave. And if the students say, I'm not going to leave, there's nothing they can do. And so we had no choice but to call police on campus at the end of last year to go ahead and remove them. And that led to a situation which was very, very negative, I think, for Columbia and for higher education. So this idea that perhaps you want to empower your own employees who wear Columbia uniforms, who have Columbia badges, and who know the students and know the unique parts of higher education, how it functions, versus calling in 600 cops from the New York Police Department and a vehicle that resembled a tank onto campus, was probably a good outcome. And it turned out that Columbia had actually been working on that for several months until that letter came out. So this was an example of commonsensical reforms that, had they come from a faculty committee, and it wouldn't surprise me if similar reforms had come from a faculty committee, they would have been completely non-controversial. But because they came on government letterhead, all of a sudden it became a frame of capitulation, which I don't think is right. But you're not interested in me. Allison has a much more interesting story over at Harvard.
Well, what happened at Harvard more recently followed.
And I haven't checked my newsfeed in like 10 minutes. So is there...
I mean, I've been up here, so who knows? It feels like every minute something else breaks. But I'll try to summarize. So on March 31st, Harvard received a letter that the federal government was reviewing about $9 billion in federal funding to Harvard because of anti-Semitism and other ideological intolerance on campus. Harvard also had other investigations that had been announced. So Harvard Medical School is one of the medical schools that the Department of Health and Human Services had said it was investigating for anti-Semitism due to things that had happened in last spring's commencement. And the Joint Task Force had named 10 campuses. I believe Columbia was one of them that it was also going to visit.
If there was a list that the government had, Columbia was probably on that list.
That's correct. And so Harvard was also one of the schools that the Joint Task Force planned to visit. On April 3rd, the government sent a new letter outlining essentially similar things to what it had outlined to Columbia of what it would like to see changed. It was much more vague than the asks to Columbia, but in similar spirit, things like enforce your rules at Harvard, improve viewpoint diversity, and other things like that. And I'd say one other thing that was different between the Columbia letter and the Harvard letter, or maybe 2 things. One was that the letter to Harvard mentioned structural reforms multiple times. So it seemed to kind of look at how can we make these lasting and meaningful changes. And it, instead of using the word compliance, said cooperate, which was different for sure. But it was vague. And then on April 7th, we just learned, due to, I believe, a Wall Street Journal or Free Press article that came out recently, that on April 7th, the Department of Health and Human Services expanded its review from just looking at Harvard Medical School to the entire University of Harvard. And on April 11th, the government sent Harvard a letter with very detailed asks for what to do, including things like audit your student body in each department for certain viewpoints or for viewpoint diversity. There's been news reports, such as like the New York Times recently said that that letter was sent by accident, and it's not very clear to me what actually happened. But in response, last week, Monday, Harvard publicly rejected the demands, publicized the demands of the letter, and hours later, the federal government froze $2.2 billion in federal funding, and throughout the week, last week, it escalated. Things like the Department of Homeland Security asking for disciplinary records of international students from Harvard or threatening to revoke Harvard's ability to host international students. The IRS supposedly is looking into removing Harvard's tax-exempt status now. The Wall Street Journal, I believe, reported a few days ago that the government's planning to freeze another $1 billion. And then most notably on Monday afternoon, Harvard filed a lawsuit to sue the federal government. And the lawsuit we sent out to our newsletter as a briefing on this 50-page complaint, but it essentially says that the government has violated Harvard's constitutional rights and is not following due process, and that Harvard does important research in the interest of the country, and that while it acknowledges that there is anti-Semitism on Harvard's campus, that for the government to fully enforce Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, the government needs to follow the due process of that, which includes doing an investigation.
All right. Now, and one part of this is the federal government expressed concerns that Harvard had been due to release a report on campus anti-Semitism last fall that still hasn't been released. Can you offer any insight into what's up with that?
I can tell you what I've read in the news about it. The public, let me step back. So when Claudine Gay was president at Harvard, she put together a task force around the time of October 7th on anti-Semitism. That task force then was disbanded, I believe around the time that she stepped down, but I don't remember exactly. Alan Garber, who's now the president at Harvard, launched his own presidential task force early in 2024, and the task forces, there was one for anti-Semitism and one for Islamophobia, set this deadline of we're going to publish reports in fall of 2024. They ended up publishing preliminary recommendations around the end of the last spring semester. These are relatively light recommendations, I'd say. People were, in all parties, I think, pretty unhappy with these as comprehensive recommendations. They were things like, we should put together a calendar of the Jewish holidays so that people know what to plan around, which is a real concern, but really not getting at the heart of a lot of the concerns people had around anti-Semitism on campus. They then blew past the fall 2024 deadline. It's now almost the end of the spring 2025 semester, and the government this past Saturday, Health and Human Services, issued a data request to Harvard to release by May 2nd the reports of both task forces, as well as all drafts and any changes that may have been made, I believe, between the time the government sent, maybe it's April 3rd letter, I'm not exactly sure, and now I think the government implying that, and maybe they actually explicitly said this in the letter, that Harvard may have tried to edit out parts that would make it look bad now that it's fighting against the government.
All right, so that's incredibly helpful. Let's start with, let me ask this. What is the Trump administration, in your mind, getting right? And what do you think they're getting wrong about the way they're pursuing these efforts?
So what I would say the Trump administration is doing right is that they are focusing attention for the first time in a generation on a persistent issue that we have that threatens us as a nation, which is the declining confidence in the value of higher education. That has been on a downward trajectory for the last couple of decades, and it is dangerous for that sort of trend to happen. What the Trump administration is getting wrong is that the Trump administration has one volume, and that volume is on. And so some of the letters, for example, the letter that was sent to Harvard was frankly overreach. It contained things that no university president could have agreed with. And so I guess what we'd like to see is more of a calibrated third way to say, what can we do? Because we need to think of this not as win and lose. We need to think of this as not as these are institutions to be destroyed, nor is it these are institutions to be protected, but rather these are institutions to be reformed for the American interest. Because that's what they are. They are critical institutions for the prosperity of the United States.
I think, I think the government, certainly the Harvard letter, as Tao mentioned, had government overreach. And I think what's happening is that even if, similar to what Tao said, many of the recommendations you could have seen come out of an internal task force at Harvard, but they have to really be done by Harvard's own volition. One, because, out of principle, like we do have to defend academic freedom, and which, by the way, does not, Harvard should be following civil rights law, to be clear. But we have to defend academic freedom, but two, because just pragmatically, for these changes to actually be meaningful and lasting, you really need them to have community buy-in and to shift the culture on campus. And that means that you're gonna have to have buy-in from the community at Harvard, and that's not gonna come fully under government duress. Now, I want to quote, for example, actually, Harvard Hillel's executive director, Rabbi Jason Rubenstein, put out a statement last Friday saying that federal civil rights law oversight has been very important in recent times, and I think he said over many years as well, and I would agree with that. And so I wouldn't say that the government is wrong at all in that. It absolutely is right. But I think that if the government were to follow the process where they do an investigation, it would help. It would be more effective for helping Jewish students on campus, probably, because it would allow the government to understand what's actually going on, share that broadly, and build an airtight case for what the right remedy is. And in the current state, I think it's actually driven some more skepticism in some ways about the government's intentions and about even the existence of anti-Semitism at Harvard.
And I want to follow up on that. Allison is absolutely right that for any reform at an institution, at an academic institution, which has where careers and tenures are measured in decades, has to come from within. And it has to come from within, because there are people there who will outlast probably 10 presidential administrations. There has to be buy-in in what people are doing, and they have to feel like they have a stake in the matter so they carry on the exercise. Otherwise, they'd just be going through the motions. And what's unfortunate about the situation that we are in right now is that it's become polarized into either do what the government said or don't do what the government said because the government said what you wanted to do. What we really need to see happening for this reform to be successful is for a conversation to be had to say, wait, some of these are actually sensible recommendations. What should we do as stakeholders in this university, be we faculty, staff, students, trustees, so on and so forth, to make sure that we accept what are appropriate for the institutions, we push back on what is clearly overreach, and we own what is what comes through at the end as what is best for the institution, best for our students, best for our faculty, best for the United States, best for the world, versus being dictated to in a way that they would find unacceptable.
Yeah, I think a skeptic, I imagine, is listening to this, like me, and saying this. There's a lot here that sounds appealing about this vision of reform, but these ideas that are sensible were sensible 2 years ago and 5 years ago, and they seem to go nowhere. There seemed to be no appetite at Harvard, Columbia, or their Ivy brethren to do this stuff. These issues that are on the table, lack of intellectual heterodoxy, kind of concerns about the stymieing of free inquiry, these have been discussed ad nauseum for a decade or more and haven't gotten addressed. So is there an appetite at the campus among the stakeholders in the leadership to actually tackle this? If so, how come it hasn't already been done? Can you help us think about what's going on and your role in all of this?
Happy to. And what I would say is for the audience out there that knows higher education, these are very slow-moving beasts. There are places where decisions take a long time to manifest, where people haggle over wording and so on and so forth. And what I would say is we are starting to see the roots, the green shoots of people on these campuses who are reformers. So one of the examples that I could think of is academic freedom councils. They have come up at Harvard, they have come up at Columbia, similar groups have come up at Princeton and at other universities as well, that basically say, hey, we are faculty, and by the way, they are all tenured faculty, who say we are faculty and we are worried about the sort of monoculture that this academy is becoming. Not because we mean to tell any individual faculty member what to say or what to think or what to teach or what to do or what to research. I mean, you be you. But it's not good for the students or for the academy or for even the field if an entire department becomes a bit of a monoculture. So we're starting to see some of these green shoots of reform coming from the faculty, which I'm very, very gratified to see. But this is a generational issue that will take a generation to resolve, to get there. On the other hand, I think there's a lot of administration on campus who, also have done what they have done for the last 30 years because there wasn't pushback, because there wasn't any sort of, there wasn't attention focused on it in a way that they could, that really put pressure on them to address. Now some of that pushback is coming, I would say coming in a big way, in the ways of the recent administrative actions, and in many ways it's a goad to action, which is why I would say what the Trump administration is doing, it's good in that it focused attention on a persistent issue of national importance. Now, whether or not the actual outcome will follow exactly the prescriptions of the Trump administration, I'm a little more skeptical. But if there's any things that we can do to help these great institutions reform themselves, that's what's best for America.
Allison, so how do you think about the role that you guys speak to the broader question, but I'm also curious about the role you see the 1636 forum playing?
Yeah, I'll speak to the broader question. So President Alan Garber at Harvard, both yesterday and last week, when pushing back against the government's demands, he said two things. He said, we're going to push back against government overreach, and we're going to make internal reforms on our own still because they are necessary. And he laid out a few broad categories, including open inquiry and viewpoint diversity, where Harvard plans to make internal reforms. I think what the school really needs to do, and I was excited to see yesterday, was he said, we're going to release our task force reports, and they provide concrete plans for implementation. And I think right now it's really hard for people to fully rally around just the idea that the school says we are going to reform ourselves. But if there's a real plan with real steps for implementation and how leaders like President Garber are going to overcome inertia or internal resistance to make those changes, not just an it's the thought that counts moment, then I think you can rally the whole community around it, and that's going to be really important. And we're playing a role, I think, of trying to, one, help people understand exactly what's going on and the broader frameworks they should be using to think about this, and just very tactically, things like, hey, we do need to see a plan. Hey, we do need to know how you're going to overcome resistance, and rallying people around that. I think one example for you, and we've had a lot of readers write in about this, is sometimes this gets framed as a trade-off between academic freedom and protecting Jewish students, or the Harvard is pushing back against the government in the name of academic freedom, and it's great to see a lot of, basically all the Harvard faculty, I think, rally to that. But part of academic freedom and open inquiry means that we need to allow students and professors to, in teaching, learning, and research, engage with a wide range of viewpoints. And so it's precisely that there needs to be some internal reforms so that students are being exposed to a wide range of viewpoints, are grappling very rigorously with these questions. And so I don't think that they're actually at odds with each other. I think it's the same mission throughout, but that means that Harvard also needs to make a lot of changes on its own.
All right, Allison, let me read you a quick sliver from your mission statement at 1636. It says, you reference a silent majority that has looked on with dismay at the erosion of Harvard's mission, governance, and campus culture over the last several years. We just spoke a bit about internal institutions. Yeah. Why has the silent majority not acted until now, if it is acting now? And what will it take for it to actually engage in driving the kind of change that you allude to?
You're making me realize we need to update our website because it's a little outdated from when we started it last year, but it's still true. There is this silent majority. From an alumni perspective, I think, most alumni are just really busy. Everyone has day jobs, and a very, very small sliver have the time to put towards understanding everything going on campus. And in that case, they're typically pushing perhaps climate issues are the one thing that they're really interested in, or maybe athletics, for example. And so it's hard for people to quickly, while leading a normal life, understand what's going on. And that's so much of why we had this newsletter. I think for faculty, as Tao said, we have a great Council on Academic Freedom at Harvard. We're very lucky to have amazing faculty who are part of that and really pushing for Harvard to make the right changes. And I think part of this is that people are coming around and realizing that some of the things that previously were done in the name of Harvard's mission might not actually be aligned with its core academic mission and with veritas or truth, which is Harvard's motto. And so, for example, I would give, I don't know if they would take credit for it, but I would give the Council on Academic Freedom at Harvard a lot of credit for the fact that the Faculty of Arts and Sciences last spring eliminated diversity statements in hiring and promotions at Harvard because they were undermining academic freedom. Now, Harvard never said that the reason they eliminated it was for that, which is a real problem. Harvard needs to be saying why it's doing things so that you can actually drive culture change. Harvard said instead, it's hard for international applicants to understand diversity statements. But I do really think that there are important efforts like that by faculty.
So I will chime in here. There is a Harvard professor who will go unnamed. He had a brilliant PhD student who was an international student that he was supervising, who was applying to postdoctoral fellowships, who went to him and said, I have to write a DEI statement and I have no idea what to do. And he said, feed the prompt into ChatGPT and feed in your resume. And that's what she did. And she got the fellowship.
I think one other thing to note on this is that at Harvard, and I don't know about at Columbia, people care a lot about consensus. And there are many reasons you should care about consensus and many reasons the cohesion on campus really matters. But as a result, this is for example, probably why we didn't say that we got rid of diversity statements because they undermine academic freedom, because that might offend people and get some people mad. But if you care too much about consensus, you can't make some of the most important changes and some of the bold strokes that are needed. And so I think in this upcoming stretch for Harvard, we're probably going to need to move away from that. And I think that's when you start to see a silent majority maybe getting more interested in getting engaged and involved when they think oh, we can make real change here and it doesn't have to be only things that we can get every single person on board with.
One of the things I've heard a lot from friends on the faculty at Harvard, but at Stanford, at a number of institutions, is, these are folks who think of themselves as progressive. And they say, Rick, I won't even speak up at faculty meetings. I used to think, I voted for Bernie Sanders, I used to think I was lefty, but I just keep my head down because there's 10%, 15% of folks on campus who are activists, and they have just, stymied the culture to the extent that you get lots of folks who just check out, and you wind up with these huge institutional distortions. I'm curious if that's at all your experience, and if so, what can organizations like yours do to kind of start to empower and give a voice to all the folks who have perhaps been reluctant to speak up?
So you raise a very good point, which is there is I would say, an undercurrent of self-censorship on campus from a lot of the faculty. And I describe it as I have to still have lunch with these people dynamic, which is my social standing, my professional standing, my relationships with my colleagues count on me behaving in a certain way, either articulating some views or failing to articulate other views. So this came to mind because there is actually a professor at Barnard, which is one of Columbia's affiliated schools, who described to me a faculty meeting that he went to, roughly a couple months ago, when there was a recent police action on Barnard's campus when a group of students and outside individuals took over a building, where the faculty caucus convened itself and held a vote to say something about the administration, and the vote was 100 to 1 or something like that. And meanwhile, this professor is sitting there saying, this doesn't seem right. So he reached out to some of the faculty members in that room that he knew and said, did you actually mean to vote that way? And the answer he got was, well, no, but I was there and I still have to have lunch with these people. And that's an interesting dynamic that I discovered. So economists call this revealed preference, I think, which is hey, there are certain things you say in your day job because what you have to do to maintain your day job and you're standing in your day job, and there's certain things that perhaps reveal more of what you think. And one of the things that we think it's very important, and I don't presume to tell faculty how to do this. They know this themselves. Is how do we get more of the view, as Allison mentioned, of these faculty who would prefer to keep their head down because they don't want to deal with the noise, because they don't want to put their tenure prospects under threat, because they don't want to be ostracized from their departments, and so on and so forth. And that's a real long-term generational issue, but it's something that is you are right to point out.
I think another dynamic, and it's perhaps slightly different at Harvard. Columbia has a university senate, and we do not at Harvard. I've never been invited to a Faculty of Arts and Sciences faculty meeting, but from what I've heard from professors, professors from the sciences don't really go to these meetings. And so, and professors from the sciences, I think in recent years have been ones that are more focused on our mission is academic excellence rather than perhaps our mission is activism on a certain political agenda, our being Harvard's mission. And so you end up with, at these meetings or in these bodies, sometimes very skewed voices. And we're gonna need to find ways probably to have professors like those in the sciences have their viewpoints better incorporated and have them take more of a leadership role, perhaps. I think, and you similarly see this on any committee, right? It's probably more likely that you're going to volunteer for a committee if you have a specific agenda you're trying to push on that committee. And for the most part, it seems like the sciences professors are really interested in doing great research in their labs.
I mean, this raises kind of, again, the structural question. And are there ways either for institutional boards to set more in the way of parameters, for institutional leaders to find a way to steer these institutions to places where the scholars who are teaching and conducting research have a bigger voice, and the gadflies and activists who have lots of time on their hands are not as influential? Like, what would it take to start to affect some of those changes?
So, it's a very timely question, because I think what many universities are discovering are their faculty, shared governance bodies are hit by these dynamics that you've described. And look, there's things that can be done. There can be term limits, for example. I remember in 2011, when I was a student at Columbia Business School, I was on the university senate, and in 2011, there was a member of that senate who had served on the senate when it was founded in 1969, which is an interesting dynamic. Now he took breaks in between, but he was still there. One thing is term limits. Another thing might be, these service on these committees, as many academics can know, are they're not seen as plum assignments. They're not paid. They're not compensated. You go to there's a lot of demands on academics' time, and this doesn't seem like, in many ways, it doesn't seem like a good use of their time. Perhaps there might be a way to incentivize it. Perhaps a modest stipend for people who might want to serve on these, or perhaps some teaching relief once every couple of years for however many semesters of service on things like this. Because I completely agree with you. Shared governance at universities is very important, but you're absolutely right that the voices in the sciences that are generating, by the way, these NIH and these NSF grants are underrepresented, partially for structural reasons, and partially because they don't have time to show up. They have to supervise their labs. They have many responsibilities. And could there be a way to incentivize them to come by painting them as not only important to the institution and good things to do and things you do as a good citizen of the community, but actually things that are valued by the institution itself, versus take on this unpaid job that is X number of hours of your time per week to go argue with people over policies that may or may not change.
Allison, 1636 Forum has written that selectively applying rules and celebrating those who break them when their politics are in vogue compromises the university's ability to foster open inquiry for all. Disruptions like relocating exams due to the encampment hinder the mission by compromising the free exchange of ideas. How have you seen any progress in terms of this kind of enforcement and kind of consistent discipline on campus yet? And what would you like to see the institution do to address these challenges?
Yeah, so what Rick is referring to is last spring, like at Columbia, Harvard had an encampment in Harvard Yard, and the rules of Harvard were not enforced, and the administrative boards who do discipline for each school at Harvard each gave different levels of disciplinary sanctions to students. So universities are famously decentralized. I think Harvard might be famously the most decentralized of them all. So every school at Harvard, the divinity school, the medical school, the college, has its own disciplinary board. And what ended up happening was that only 2 of the schools actually gave sanctions to students. And a lot of this, the college being one of them, so these are like 18-year-olds. And eventually, most of them got overturned, and part of the reason being that these students, kind of understandably, were like, hey, I did way less bad of things than some of the graduate students at these professional schools, and they never got any sanctions, and I'm only 18 years old. And that's an understandable argument. A very basic thing that could happen that hasn't happened yet, centralizing and standardizing discipline for non-academic misconduct. I totally understand why the medical school should get to set its own ChatGPT policy, but it's not really clear to me why, if one medical student punches another medical student, you need a medical school faculty to be the one determining that. President Garber has done one step in this direction. He standardized and centralized the fact-finding process across the schools, but not any of the adjudication. And one of the things that actually the government asked for, and I believe in yesterday's letter, President Garber indicated Harvard on its own wants to do, is do more of the centralizing and standardizing of discipline. Now, there hasn't been an encampment yet this year, so it's hard to know exactly what Harvard would do if confronted with the same situation, but I will say that when it comes to other things, such as there were study-in protests in the library, Harvard suspended student library access for 2 weeks when that happened. Professors responded by doing their own study-in. Their library access was suspended for 2 weeks. And more recently, in the last few weeks, we've seen the dean of the college say that unrecognized student groups should not get to use Harvard resources. And we've seen resident deans actually do things like revoke meeting room access and use for student groups and refer students to the disciplinary board if they book rooms for those groups. And those groups have really been behind a lot of the academically disruptive activities on campus. But I don't think we'll fully know for a while. One other thing, though, is these disciplinary boards, they cite precedent a lot, which makes a lot of sense in a disciplinary process. But for years, as you said in that quote, Harvard didn't really enforce its rules on time, place, and manner rules. This has nothing to do with content of speech. And so at some point, I think the university probably has to say, you know what, reset. From now on, we're going to enforce the rules, and you can only set precedent from this point forward. Otherwise, you're just going to keep going back and citing these prior incidents where, at some point in the early 2000s, I think there was a sit-in in University Hall and, blatant violations of time, place, and manner rules. And Harvard ended up giving awards at graduation to the students who did this. And so that obviously makes it hard now for the school to say, well, we're giving fair discipline to you, even though we used to give awards to students who did the same
thing. Stanford Columbia has got a quote which says, Columbia's cautious approach is not cowardice or capitulation. It's basic financial reality and prudent financial management. Can you talk a bit about what that means and how that comes into this context?
Absolutely, and this kind of greatly ties into how I introduced Stan Columbia. Is we're here to educate people on how universities work. So Columbia and Harvard and most universities publish their financials online. Nobody reads them. The Stan Columbia team includes a lot of people who can read balance sheets and read income statements and can do calculations on these things. And so we actually got a lot of attention when we started publishing our deep dives into Columbia's financials. So we found, for example, that Columbia's total institutional risk exposure to government action is something like $3.5 billion a year on a $6.6 billion revenue line. Harvard, I think the number is something like $5.5 billion on about $10 billion of adjusted revenue if you bring in the hospitals. And we had all these people saying, well, we have a $15 billion endowment, or in Harvard's case, we have a $53 billion endowment. We should be able to weather this storm. And we started doing the math, and we said, actually, Columbia, if it were to decapitalize its unrestricted endowment, would last less than 2 years. For Harvard, it would be less than 5 years, and so on and so forth. And so what we were doing is we were having the conversations that people are loath to have, either because they don't understand it, or they don't think the rules apply to academia, or so on and so forth. But it wasn't that long ago. In fact, it was the 1980s when some of the old hands at Columbia will tell you there were months when Columbia wasn't sure it was able to make payroll. And you know, and that basically went into a lot of these recent postings we did, where we did deep financial analysis, because we think that's a missing piece of the conversation in understanding how Columbia works and how any university works, which is these are not, you know, very asset-rich universities that can do whatever they want, and a lot of them are not asset-rich. You know, even universities that may be asset-rich on paper might be fragile when it comes to cash flow, for example. And these are basic financial realities that have to be communicated, because people have to understand that that the same rules that apply to companies and to households also apply to Columbia University. You know, lacking a Federal Reserve, although we have several people in our faculty who served on the Federal Reserve, Columbia University cannot print its own currency. And so there are limitations in what it can do in the public sphere when, frankly, you know, since 1945, there have been, frankly, no real private universities left in the United States other than Halesdale College and a handful of small religiously affiliated schools. For comprehensive research universities like Harvard, like Columbia, and like many of the others out there, in many cases, a quarter to a third of their funding comes from the federal government. And that's a reality that universities live with today. And understanding that reality and accepting it and calibrating its actions in a framework of preserving what made these universities great to begin with, and by extension, what made America great to begin with, is something that's very, very important for us to do.
All right, with that, why don't we go ahead and open it up? Why don't we start with Jenna? That's your hand or no? Yeah. Okay.
Hi, I'm Jenna Story. I'm a scholar here at AEI, but prior to this, I was a faculty member in political philosophy at Furman. Thank you so much for coming. This was very informative, and I'm also really grateful for the work you're doing. I had a question maybe for Tal, but maybe for either of you. And don't take this as a cynical question, but really a curious one. Why is shared governance important? We've talked about how universities are longstanding institutions. They've been around maybe since Plato's Academy in one form or another, but I think shared governance is pretty recent. Maybe 1915, really the way we exercise it now, 60s, 70s. So why is it important? Why is it good? Even if it isn't age old, why should we preserve it? How should we preserve what's best in it?
I'll be happy to answer the question. So I think it's important for two reasons. First, because there are certain topics, academic topics, for example, in which a faculty body is much better placed to make a judgment on than an administrative body. So for example, what curriculum do we teach? What syllabi do we prescribe? What degrees do we offer? You know, which faculty members do we give tenure to? A faculty member or faculty members that are deeply, you know, deep in their subject matters are much better qualified to place this than you know, administrators who may be one step removed or two steps removed. I think the second reason goes to the fundamental nature of universities and faculty members, and they're going to hate this term, as knowledge workers. Faculty members do not make widgets, they produce knowledge. And as a result, their place in the academy is not dissimilar to how a professional services firm, like a law firm, for example, or a consulting firm operates. For those of you who are familiar with law firms, you know, you'll know that law firms have managing partners, but that managing partner cannot necessarily dictate to other partners in the firm how that operates. And that dynamic is very much the case at universities. They see themselves as you know, very, and they are, by the way, very, very deep and steeped in their knowledge and in their subjects of expertise for which some degree of faculty oversight, in fact, if not a large degree of faculty oversight, is necessary. But secondarily, they operate in a peer-like environment where you know, professors are seen as peers to each other and not necessarily the sort of top-down hierarchical model we see in corporate America. One very interesting thing that I found from reading Columbia's charter, which dates to 1810, which, by the way, nobody reads, is that Columbia's faculty are not appointed by the president or by the deans or by the provost. They are appointed by the board of trustees. So a tenured faculty member at Columbia, his or her boss is not the dean or the department chair or the provost or even the president, it is actually the trustees themselves. And that creates an intentionally like flat hierarchy where, if you were to ask me, I would say it's probably the most conducive for knowledge to form organically.
Allison?
We don't have, as I said, a university senate at Harvard. There's a planning body putting forth a proposal for that currently. So we'll see soon if we end up getting one. But I think one thing worth noting on this topic is that it's actually some of these underlying questions that may have brought us to where we are today. There's increasingly this mindset of students where we're the customer, and so the school has to deliver the product that we specifically want. And I think that sometimes that has good effects, but there's also a lot of negative effects to that. I went to the business school. This is especially prevalent at the business school that people like to say we're the customer. But for example, I think we've seen an increase in students who want emotional affirmation from the school, not just intellectual affirmation, and that leads to more safetyist mindsets in some ways and more reporting of professors or classes to the administration if students feel that they've heard something that makes them feel unsafe in the classroom. And I think we actually probably need to think less in a customer mindset and more about the unique ways in which faculty bring something to the university.
Although, it seems to me that faculty governance has been utterly feckless at confronting things like grade inflation or maintaining kind of rigorous expectations for students. For one thing, there seems to be a collective action problem where nobody wants to be the mean faculty member. Are your organizations interested in things like academic rigor and grade inflation? What kind of role are you playing on that?
I would say actually, so at Harvard specifically, faculty governance might actually be the solution on that. And so the reason I say that is the Faculty of Arts and Sciences recently issued a report out of its Classroom Social Compact Committee, led by Professors David Lapes and Maya Jasanoff, about the situation in the classroom at Harvard. And things that they found were that students do not consider academics to be the core part of their experience at Harvard, that faculty view this with alarm, students are not going to class. I don't know if it was part of the report, but at least one student wrote in the Crimson and op-ed afterwards that when you're a freshman at Harvard these days, you go to these pre-professional clubs like the Harvard College Consulting Club, and the way these clubs introduce themselves are like, hey, one of the best parts of coming to Harvard is you don't have to go to class. That's not great. And this report actually pushed the Faculty of Arts and Sciences to recently vote almost unanimously, I think it was one abstaining, to make class attendance mandatory. And students are literally, I've talked to students, they're like, yep, sorry, I have to go to class now because it's now mandatory. And I think that's huge, and I real props to the Faculty of Arts and Sciences for doing that, to the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences for asking for this report. And so I think that shared governance can solve some of those problems. So when it comes to grade inflation, this does seem like a bit of a collective action problem because, when I was in undergrad, I believe at the time Princeton was doing grade deflation, and I have friends now who say that that grade deflation has hurt them in their careers and their applications to grad school for more than a decade after. And so Harvard doesn't really have an incentive to deal with grade inflation if none of its peers are, because Harvard students will probably, get admitted to medical school at a lower rate, for example. That would be actually an interesting place for people to think about, does government play a role there? Because the government's currently looking at price fixing at some of the schools, so I think the schools would probably be pretty hesitant to work together on let's all address this grade inflation issue. But I think it's a really important one because, again, I went to the business school, people always are like, as an employer, it's really hard to know who the best students are because of compression and inflation. And that is certainly a problem. I faced that myself trying to hire out of these schools. But two, the students don't know if they're learning. They need to have real grades so that they know if they're mastering the material. And it is academic malpractice that we're not helping them understand if they're learning or if they need to be doing more work and seeking out more support. And so I think we do need to address this, but I don't know about how to solve it without addressing the collective action problem.
Rick, I'll say one very quick thing, then we should probably get onto a second question, which is faculty governance also has to have limits. I see the proper role for faculty governance on academic matters. Degrees, what degrees do we issue? What majors do we offer? What syllabi do we prescribe? What sort of, who do we grant tenure to? But there is a view among many faculty that their jurisdiction is basically universal, which is aside from these academic matters, I want to weigh in on this, I want to weigh in on that, I want to weigh in on this, I want to weigh in on, I want to weigh in on Title VI enforcement, I want to weigh in on our working capital terms for our vendors, and so on and so forth. And what I would say about faculty governance is that there has to be expectations set that there are certain matters which are appropriate for faculty governance and certain matters which are not.
Chris, what do we got?
Hi, Richard Collenberg with the Progressive Policy Institute. This is a great discussion. I feel like there was a lot of momentum for reform. You had the Students for Fair Admissions decision, which exposed anti-Asian bias and kind of corruption generally in the admissions process, and a reduction in racial preferences. Progress on the diversity statements, they were seen as political litmus tests. They started to go away. And then after October 7th, I think decent Americans were horrified by October 7th, horrified a second time by student reactions, before there was any counteroffensive, just denouncing Israel. So lots of appetite for reform. And then, as I think you're suggesting, Trump overreached and was imposing, illiberalism. He's using illiberal means to try to get illiberal ends. And I'm just worried that the reform movement has now lost its gas. Donald Trump's probably the one guy who could make Harvard look good, right? They're now seen as heroes because they're standing up to excesses. Is there hope that you have for recapturing the movement for reform?
Yeah, I think we're in a difficult position, and I am worried that internal reform efforts are being stymied and that people are going to have the wind taken out of their sails on some of these things because of government overreach. But I also think that now more than ever, people should be recommitting to the core commitment of these schools for academic excellence and truth, and creating a learning environment for all students that enables that. And I think the more that the pushback against government overreach is centered in we're doing it because it's the right thing for a mission around academic excellence and academic freedom, and not we're doing it because we think it's important for us to be the face of a resistance on the progressive side to Trump, the more that Harvard and other schools will be able to rally internally to make the changes needed and make a case that probably broadly the public can buy into. That's a careful line to walk. I think Alan Garber did a masterful job walking it in his letter yesterday to the community. Now he has to deliver on it. He needs two plans. He needs a plan for how are we going to weather the financial storm that Tao said, and make difficult decisions on what to cut during that, and how are we going to actually drive all these internal reforms that he's saying that we're going to do. And when he lays those out and actually makes quick progress in executing against it, I think you're going to actually see even more momentum than before. But you really, really have to do that quickly. And I think we have to do it in a way where over the summer, faculty either don't lose steam or use it as a time to recuperate and get ready to really come back in the fall and make these changes and have them make a noticeable impact immediately on campus.
So what I would say to that answer is we can overcome this if we can overcome what I call the toddler problem. So for those of you who have children, at some point your child, when he or she was 2 years old, probably said to you, I'm going to bed, but because I'm tired, not because you told me to. In many ways, that is the dynamic going on right now. And as Allison mentioned, this is a wire that university presidents have to walk. I hope they do it successfully because the country needs them to do this successfully.
I think we have time for one more question, a quick one. Chris, who do you got? Oh, right here.
I'm curious in particular
Go ahead and
about
introduce yourself.
Mark Nadell, just independent. Curious about Trump asking for additional spots in different departments to add viewpoint diversity. Tao, you mentioned the monoculture. Is that something that you think the faculty would be receptive towards? Or is that something, say, well, over the next 30 years, we'll gradually add in some more diverse faculty?
That's a very hard question to answer. And I would say because it's very hard to impose that top down. So I can't see any university president saying, history department, hire 10 conservative history professors. That's just going to be very, very difficult to do. Where are you going to find them? How will when they are hired, when they show up on campus, how will they not be tainted reputationally from being a result of something like that? I think what's more realistic in this case is that, and what I hope will happen, and Allison, be interested in hearing your thoughts, is that faculty will look at themselves in a mirror and say, wait a second, as we grow this department, as faculty retire, as we selectively add on new faculty members? Do we want to continue going the way things are, given the pressure that is on us as a university and given the falling public confidence in higher education? Or would it be better for us as a department, as an academy, as a profession, to have more viewpoint diversity in our ranks? I am optimistic, but I completely understand that a lot of people are saying, well, wait a second, this has been a problem for a while. Why hasn't anything been happened? To that, I can only say it probably took us 30 or 40 years to get to this point, and it will probably take an equivalent amount of time to get back to the intellectual environment that we had in the 90s.
I would take a bit of a different angle and maybe even more optimistically. I'd say across the last decade, a lot of these things changed, and a decade's a really short time, and we can change a lot of things in the next decade. And so I'm quite optimistic about what we can do in higher ed, and I don't think we necessarily need to think on the 30 to 40-year time horizon. I think for a lot of these fields, it's less sometimes about conservative viewpoints and liberal viewpoints, and more about hiring needs to be on the basis of excellence, and that needs to be the focus. And if we are going to be excellent in hiring, I do think we will, as a result, cast a wider net and be more open to viewpoints who aren't represented on campus currently. But I don't think this is necessarily about, as some have argued, getting affirmative action for conservative viewpoints in certain categories. I'd say, for example, the history department at Harvard, I think currently, now that Neil Ferguson has left, it doesn't have a military historian. That's not about conservative or liberal. That's just, if you're a student concentrating in history, you probably should have the chance to learn military history. And there are some excellent military historians out there, and we should be looking to hire them so that students get an academically excellent education.
I like this, right? So closing on a note like, let's have a broad kind of body of scholarship, and let's value excellence and merit. I love this. It's crazy. It's good stuff. Thank you, guys. Really appreciate the work you are doing. Appreciate you taking the time to be with us here today. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks so much. Terrific job, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.